You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Elections Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's the early part of 1923, and a visitor follows a presidential aide through the main entrance of the White House. The doorman nods politely and greets him as he passes by. "How do you do, sir?" "How do you do?" This visitor has an important meeting with a very important man, Republican President Warren G. Harding. The visitor follows the aide through the entrance area to a crossing hall. There are 3 doors lining the wall. The aide gestures to the door on the right. "The president is waiting for you, sir." "Thank you." As the visitor approaches the entrance to the Red Room, he hears voices inside, shouting.
"I know what to do with you. Sir, please. By God, I know exactly what to do."
Concerned, the visitor opens the door to the Red Room. Inside, he sees President Harding throttling a man in a suit. "You yellow rat!" The president throws the man against the wall, his hands wrapped around his neck. As the man struggles to breathe, the president screams, "You double-crossing bastard! If you ever—" Just then, the president's eyes catch the visitor's. Seeing him, Harding lets loose his grip. The man in the suit staggers away, gasping for air. Harding's face is blotched and distorted with rage, but he zips up his anger and politely turns to the visitor. "Excuse me. I'm sorry about that." "No, forgive me, Mr. President." No, it's quite fine. You have an appointment." The president gestures to the door. "Our meeting is meant to be in the next room. I'll be with you in just a moment." "Of course, sir. Thank you, sir." After his tense meeting with President Harding, the visitor goes on his way. As he leaves the White House through the main entrance, the visitor asks the doorman, "I'm sorry to bother you, but who was the man with the president when I arrived?" "Why, that's Colonel Forbes of the Veterans Bureau." In his biography on President Warren G. Harding, American author Francis Russell doesn't name the visitor who walked in on the President of the United States choking Colonel Forbes. And though there are no other accounts of the incident, the story has largely been accepted as fact. One day earlier, according to Russell, President Harding learned that his friend Charles Forbes, the head of the newly established Veterans Affairs Bureau, was no better than a common thief. Forbes had sold government supplies to friends who in turn had sold them at marked up prices. In exchange, Forbes received a series of massive kickbacks. After Harding confronted him in the Red Room, Colonel Forbes fled to Europe to escape prosecution and resigned his post. A subsequent investigation would reveal that Forbes had cheated the government out of more than $200 million, over $3 billion in today's money. Forbes would be brought back to the United States and indicted for bribery and corruption. He would be tried, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years in Leavenworth. The Veterans Affairs scandal would be the first of many under the Harding administration. Bribery, fraud, blackmail, and sex formed the basis for what would come to be called the Teapot Dome, a series of scandals that would shock the American people, rattle the Republican Party, and cast a shadow over the 1924 presidential contest. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. There's that saying, that's just the cost of doing business, and it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do about certain expenses. And yeah, sure, if you run a business, there are certain things that are just going to cost what they cost, and recently they've probably begun costing more. But not everything is just the cost of doing business. Smart companies know their numbers and can reduce their costs. One great way of doing both is switching to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessible from anywhere. You'll cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite, and you improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections, netsuite.com/elections. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. I need to get something off my chest. Think about that phrase. Visualize it. The metaphor is that something is literally on your chest, weighing you down, pressing down upon you, that when you lay in bed at night, there's a heavy burden bearing down on you. And everyone has these weights, deep concerns, feelings of guilt, anger, or misery we try to keep to ourselves. But therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. And if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. No waiting rooms, no traffic. It couldn't be simpler. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. President Warren G. Harding once said, "A great many people think it is a fine thing to be president, but I know better." In the 1920 election, Harding had campaigned on the promise of a return to normalcy, and he had, in part, delivered. Harding negotiated a post-World War I peace. He instituted new government offices like the Bureau of Veterans Affairs and the Bureau of the Budget. He cut taxes and expenditures and kept the government out of the way of big business. These efforts resulted in a booming economy. The Roaring Twenties had arrived. Still, despite his many accomplishments, by 1923, President Harding was growing weary of the office. In January of 1923, he suffered from a severe bout of the flu, and by the spring of that year, Harding's health was failing. He lacked energy, his face had lost its color, and his blood pressure was rising. The Veterans Affairs scandal did little to improve Harding's mental or physical health, but it was just the beginning. The first in a long list of scandals that rocked the Harding White House, arguably the most scandal-ridden administration in American history. But in the end, Harding's health would be his undoing. 6 months after Harding throttled Charles Forbes at the White House, he died of a heart attack. In the wake of Harding's death, the sins of his administration would be Vice President Calvin Coolidge's cross to bear. To overcome his predecessor's many scandals, Coolidge would rely on the wisdom of an old adage. This is episode 35, 1924, Coolidge versus Davis versus LaFollette. Silence is golden. It's August 2nd, 1923, 2:30 a.m. at a small farmhouse in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, owned by the Coolidge family. Vice President Calvin Coolidge and his wife, Grace Anna Coolidge, sleep soundly in an upstairs bedroom. But when Coolidge hears the sound of footsteps squeaking up the stairs, his eyes flutter open. Then he hears a familiar voice calling out,
Calvin? Calvin, open the door.
His father's voice trembles. He's only heard that sort of quiver a handful of times before, only when death had paid a visit to the family. Concerned, Coolidge slides out of bed. As he does, his wife, Grace Anna, wakes. "What's wrong, dear?" I don't know." Coolidge opens the door to find his father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., looking white as a ghost. The elder Coolidge holds an official-looking document in his shaking hands. Before the son can ask what's wrong, the father hands him the document. "President Harding is dead." Vice President Coolidge is a man of few words, but he is also a man of action. After learning of President Harding's death, he wastes no time. After saying a quick prayer for President Harding's loved ones and the American people, Coolidge gets right to work. He throws on clothes and heads to the family office. There, he quickly dispatches a telegram to Mrs. Harding to offer his condolences. He then drafts a statement for the press meant to reassure the American people. Lastly, he types up the most important document of all, the oath of office. When Coolidge joins his father in the sitting room, it's pitch dark, save for a small kerosene lamp. Coolidge stands in front of his father. On a table by his side sits a Bible that belonged to his late mother. Filled with emotion, his father begins the sacred ritual. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. The night of Harding's death, Coolidge's father administered the oath in his capacity as a notary public. In a quiet room with no fanfare, in front of a small group of witnesses that included his wife, his chauffeur, a stenographer, and a senator who lived nearby, Calvin Coolidge became America's 30th president. The impromptu inauguration was recreated in a composite photograph that was widely printed in newspapers all across the country. The quaint image helped to create an instant bond between Coolidge, the folksy conservative, and the bereaved American people. But as the months wore on, that bond would be tested. Coolidge inherited Harding's administration, and with it, a litany of scandals. To survive the political gauntlet and secure the Republican nomination in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge would do what he had always done: keep his mouth shut. From day one, the Republican Party rallied behind Calvin Coolidge. As one Republican said in the fall of 1923, there is no doubt whatever in my mind that Mr. Coolidge will be, as he very righteously should be, the nominee of the party in 1924. Still, Coolidge's prospects for the nomination were threatened by a series of scandals, collectively known as the Teapot Dome. Rumors of scandal had seemed to always follow President Harding. As a player in the newspaper business back in Ohio, Harding had been accused of rigging printing contracts to line his pockets. He had cheated on his wife with multiple partners and even fathered a child with a young woman named Nan Britton, one of his mistresses. It was alleged that Harding slept with Nan in a closet in the White House. The Teapot Dome, though, was the biggest scandal of them all. The name refers to a giant rock formation in Wyoming in the shape of a teapot. It sits on a tract of land under which lies oil. Though on its face the Teapot Dome scandal was about oil, it was also a complex web of cover-ups, bribes, and blackmail that stretched deep into the Harding administration. At the heart of the scandal was a man named Albert Bacon Fall, a former Secretary of the Interior and Republican senator from New Mexico. Harding had always had the utmost confidence in Senator Fall. He had once said, "If Albert Fall isn't an honest man, I'm not fit to be President of the United States." But Fall was not honest. As head of the Interior Department, he had accepted large bribes from oil companies. In exchange, these companies were given exclusive drilling rights to federal lands in Wyoming and California. Harding had been elected president with the financial backing of the oil industry, and he had handpicked Fall to run the Interior Department back in 1921. These facts alone make Harding look complicit, and indeed he was. Rumors of the scandal had begun swirling in the press as far back as 1922, and those rumors had led to congressional investigation. In January of 1923, Fall had resigned from the Interior Department and retired to New Mexico on a ranch he had purchased with some of the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had earned in the scheme. Harding and government officials had bribed members of the press and others to keep the story under wraps, but the truth would eventually come to light. The schemes that comprised the Teapot Dome scandal had taken place during the 881 days of Warren G. Harding's presidency. Though Harding was spared public humiliation by his death, the stain of the Teapot Dome largely fell on his legacy. As Harding's vice president, Calvin Coolidge was in danger of being guilty by association. The scandal came to light during the first 6 months of Coolidge's presidency. If he wanted to keep the White House and be elected president in his own right, Coolidge needed to escape the sins of Harding. It might be said that Coolidge's campaign for president began the night Harding passed away. From the very beginning, Coolidge resolved to run a dignified campaign in the tradition of George Washington. He would not stump for his candidacy. He would not attack his opponent or launch a tour. He would focus on the job of the presidency and let his actions do the talking. When Coolidge became president, the economy was booming, in large part thanks to the pro-business policies of Warren G. Harding. Coolidge embraced those policies. He pledged to reduce the debt, resist higher taxes, and push the U.S. agenda on the world stage. Coolidge's approach to governing is summed up best with his own words. The business of America is business. And the booming economy made Coolidge instantly popular with the people, and it all but solidified his status as the presumptive Republican nominee. But Teapot Dome had to be reconciled somehow. As one Washington insider put it, Teapot Dome is going to be a very heavy load for Mr. Coolidge to carry. And though Coolidge had not actively played a part in the scandal, his proximity to those who did painted a dubious picture, one his enemies in the Democratic Party would no doubt try to capitalize on. And indeed, a new round of investigations into the Teapot Dome were set to begin in October of 1923. Coolidge asked his good friend, Supreme Court Justice and former President William Howard Taft for advice on how to deal with the scandal. Taft told him, "Do nothing. Your wisest course is to be quiet for a while." Silent Cal took Taft's advice to heart, for the most part. He said little, but he didn't do nothing. Once again, he let his actions speak louder than words. Coolidge appointed 2 special prosecutors, one Republican and one Democrat, to lead the investigation into Senator Fall's shady oil dealings. In the end, Fall would be convicted of bribery, fined $100,000, and sentenced to a year in prison. By taking the investigation by the reins, Coolidge had distanced himself from the scandal and let the institutions of government do their jobs. The result was that President Coolidge emerged from the scandal looking like the embodiment of moral rectitude, a quiet reserve of decency and strength. Hanging on the wall in the Coolidge living room was a poem that read, "A wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we be like that old bird?" But Silent Cal was not mute. Coolidge had bi-weekly press conferences at the White House. He cultivated rapport with journalists and used those friendships to get his message to the people. He also made good use of new technologies. Though President Harding had given the first presidential radio address in June of 1922, Coolidge was the first president to use that technology as a campaign tool. He didn't need to stump for his candidacy or go on the road. He stayed at the White House and used the radio to amplify his message and talk directly to the American voter. And then in December of 1923, Calvin Coolidge became the first president to film a speech and then broadcast the audio out over the radio, making his case for a conservative approach to government.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom. Until we can reestablish a condition under which the earnings of the people can be kept by the people, we are bound to suffer a very severe and distinct curtailment of our liberty.
Coolidge's speech was broadcast to over half the country. The New York Times wrote that Coolidge was heard by more people than the voice of any man in history. His use of the radio helped him form a bond with the American people, and his advocacy for conservative government solidified him as a friend to Wall Street. But his message of limited government did not resonate with the progressive faction of the Republican Party. That faction, however, was dwindling in strength and had been since the death of progressive champion Teddy Roosevelt in 1919. During the tenure of progressive Democrat President Woodrow Wilson, the Republican Party had largely moved in a more conservative direction. And so at the 1924 National Convention, Republicans would speak with a more unified voice. They would nominate Calvin Coolidge for the presidency and adopt a strictly conservative platform. This would leave many progressive Republicans, men like former Wisconsin governor and current Senator Robert M. LaFollette, with a bad taste in their mouths. Left with no alternative, LaFollette would abandon the Republicans and strike out on his own. There he would find a political ally in the most unlikely of places, the Democratic Party. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com.
Just before Halloween in 1985, a pipe bomb exploded in an office building in downtown Salt Lake City, killing a man and leaving the entire city on edge. As the smoke cleared and investigators began the search for answers, it became terrifyingly clear that this was just the beginning. Suddenly, looking for the culprit became a race against time. Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the new true crime history podcast, American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, the desperate hunt for a killer leads the authorities through the complicated world of historic document collectors, and eventually right to the door of the Mormon Church. Listen to American Criminal: The Salt Lake City Bombings, wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.
It's early spring 1924 in Clarksburg, West Virginia. The citizens of Clarksburg are all abuzz. The Democratic National Convention, set to take place in late June in New York, is the talk of the town because Clarksburg's native son, John W. Davis, is on the short list for the Democratic Party's nomination. As Davis winds his way through the crowded streets, he's deeply frustrated. He does not want to be the Democratic nominee. Davis has a thriving law practice and a roster of powerful Wall Street clients who require his attention. But Davis's friends in West Virginia have been relentless. As he rounds a corner onto a main thoroughway, he sees one of these persistent friends, Clem Shaver, the former chair of the West Virginia State Democratic Convention. Clem! Mr. Davis! Oh, why the long face? Don't play the fool with me. I've just learned you and your friends have opened up campaign offices for me all across West Virginia. Yes, as a matter of fact, we did. I already told you no, and I told you I wouldn't take no for an answer. Davis sighs, frustrated. I've had my fill of politics, Clem. It damn near broke me. Your spirits or your bank account? Both. Listen, John. No, you listen. I've given you my answer. The party needs a compromise candidate, John. You're the only one who can bring the two factions together. Davis knows Clem is right. The progressive Democrats like him because he served under Woodrow Wilson. The conservatives like him for his ties to Wall Street. But Davis's mind is made up. Your friend, Mr. Huntley, he already begged me to leave my law practice. Yes, I'm aware. Then you must also be aware I refused him. I won't do it, Clem. Mr. Huntley was only suggesting that you leave your law firm because it might be in the party's best interest for you to remove the taint of Wall Street from your name. Even if I were willing to stand as the party's nominee, which I am not, I would not leave my law practice for anything. Besides, I believe it was Mark Twain who said all Wall Street money has a double taint. Taint yours, taint mine. Clem gives Davis a cryptic smile. Well, we're not so worried about your Wall Street ties, not anymore. What in the world is that supposed to mean? Clem pats Davis on the back and flashes him a knowing smile. No. This is our affair. You're not responsible for what your fool friends do. Despite Davis's protestations, his friends in West Virginia, men like Clem Shaver and John Huntley, refused to back down. To get him off his back, Davis wrote a lengthy letter of declination. He explained that he would never abandon his Wall Street clients, men he called honorable, upright, and loyal. Davis concluded by writing, "Any lawyer who surrenders duty to fit the gusts of popular opinion not only dishonors himself, but degrades the great profession to which he should be proud to belong." Davis considered the matter closed, but his friends did not. On March 30th, 1924, Mr. Huntley had the letter published in the Pittsburgh Post. The positive reaction in the press was, to use Huntley's word, instantaneous. The flood of editorial comments that resulted praised Davis as a man of principle who was perfectly suited for his party's nomination. So thanks to his fool friends, John W. Davis was well positioned to become the compromise candidate, whether he wanted to be or not. While the West Virginia Democrats schemed to position Davis as a dark horse candidate, the Republican establishment rallied around President Calvin Coolidge. In the lead-up to the Republican convention, Coolidge's nomination was all but assured. As one North Carolina newspaper, the News and Observer, wrote, There is none who can surpass Calvin Coolidge in honesty, in courage, or in high devotion to his country. Coolidge had done a masterful job of distancing himself from the Teapot Dome scandals, and his popularity was on the rise thanks to a flourishing economy bolstered by his continuation of Harding's pro-business policies. That prosperity was on full display at the Republican Convention in June of 1924. The convention was held in Cleveland, Ohio, a booming industrial town with a thriving automobile industry. The city was flush with cash, as evidenced by Cleveland's brand-new public auditorium that seated 10,000. Though the Republican National Convention did not max out the venue, it came close. The event started with a tribute to the life of Warren G. Harding. The platform itself began in similar fashion. It stated, "We, the delegates of the Republican Party, in National Convention assembled, bow our heads in reverent memory of Warren G. Harding." But the real star of the show was Calvin Coolidge. The New York Times had summed up what they thought the Republican platform should be with 3 simple words: Coolidge, that's all. The 1924 Republican Convention was the first to be broadcast over the radio. 20 million Americans listened as the Republican delegates cast their votes. Still, the event did not necessarily make for exciting listening. As the humorist Will Rogers observed, the convention was so uneventful it could have been done by postcard. Still, it was momentous for at least one man. Calvin Coolidge's father listened to his son win the nomination in the same room where he had administered the presidential oath less than a year before. The party's conservatism was also on display. Charles G. Dawes, a conservative banker and future Nobel Prize winner, was chosen as Coolidge's running mate. The party platform was a continuation of the Harding-Coolidge pro-business agenda. Still, in spite of his popularity, Coolidge's nomination was not unanimous. A handful of votes went to a progressive senator from Wisconsin, Robert M. LaFollette, also known by his nickname, Fighting Bob. During the convention, LaFollette supporters had been booed, heckled, and shouted down by the conservative majority. After his crushing defeat at the convention, Fighting Bob was beginning to feel like a politician without a party. So he began to consider the prospect of forming his own. As LaFollette plotted his next move, the Democrats prepared for their national convention in Madison Square Garden in New York. Years after the 1924 election, a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun would write, "For there is something about a national convention. It is vulgar, it is ugly, it is stupid, it is tedious, it is hard upon both the higher cerebral centers and the gluteus maximus." But if the Republican convention was a yawn, the Democratic convention was a dogfight. It was arguably the most contentious convention in American political history, and from one reporter, it earned a name befitting the ugliness of the affair: the Klan Bank. The Democratic Party was split into 2 factions, one conservative, one progressive. These factions were largely split along sectional lines, north and south. The progressives backed Georgia's William Gibbs McAdoo, President Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law. The conservatives backed New York Governor Al Smith, but neither man was popular enough to secure the 2/3 majority required for victory. The result was a gridlock convention that nearly turned violent. Former Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo was, like his father-in-law Woodrow Wilson, a racist. In 1924, McAdoo had the full-throated endorsement of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had largely been eradicated under the presidency of General Ulysses S. Grant, but during the Progressive era, the Knights of the KKK had made a very public resurgence, especially in the South, where they wreaked havoc on the lives of immigrants and people of color. And in the 1920s, the Klan was a major player in Democratic politics, so McAdoo did not disavow its endorsement, he embraced it. McAdoo was a strong advocate for prohibition, which, like the racism of the Klan, enjoyed popular support in the South. McAdoo was also an advocate for some unfinished business started by his father-in-law, Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations. After World War I, the League of Nations, a peacetime global coalition, had been Woodrow Wilson's dream. McAdoo hoped to succeed where his father-in-law had failed. Standing in his way, though, was the conservative faction of the party. McAdoo and the progressives despised Governor Smith, in no small part because Smith was a Catholic. He was also anti-prohibition, anti-KKK, and anti-League of Nations. He was, in short, anti-McAdoo. As the 2 factions debated the issues, the convention quickly went off the rails. Yelling matches turned into scuffles, and scuffles into brawls. Were it not for the New York police officers standing guard, the violence might have gotten out of hand. And amidst the ferocious back and forth, neither side could get the numbers to win. As the reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun wrote, "There may not be enough Kluxers in the convention to nominate McAdoo, but there are probably enough to beat any anti-Klan candidate. All are on their tiptoes today, their hands clutching their artillery nervously, and their eyes a-pop for dynamite bombs." The reporter for the Sun also made a prediction. Everything is uncertain in this convention but one thing: John W. Davis will never be nominated. But the reporter failed to recognize that John W. Davis was perhaps the only man who could bring the two camps together. Davis had served as President Wilson's Solicitor General and later his ambassador to Great Britain. He was more than just a politician. He was a successful lawyer who had used his considerable talent to represent big business. And while his ties to Wall Street made many progressives nervous, it satisfied many conservatives. Meanwhile, Davis's ties to Woodrow Wilson helped many progressives get on board. Additionally, Davis possessed a quality that both sides agreed was an asset. On the big wedge issues, Davis was politically neutral. After 103 ballots and 16 days, the convention finally had its nominee. As the New York Times explained it, when the debris began to fall, somebody looked underneath the pile and dragged out John W. Davis. After rigorous debate, the Democrats eventually settled on a platform that centered around a handful of issues on which both sides could agree: rooting out Republican corruption, keeping tariffs low, and protecting states' rights. But on the most divisive issues, the platform was less solid. The Washington Post said, "It will go to the country in November, containing pussyfooting compromises on two great issues which have all but rent it asunder: the League of Nations and the Ku Klux Klan." The Democrats did not leave their convention united behind Davis. Far from it. Not long after the convention, one delegate wrote to future Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, "We defeated ourselves in New York." The convention came at a great political cost. Like the Republican convention in Cleveland, the Democrats' convention in New York was broadcast all over the radio to millions of Americans who had a front row seat to the shameful display of disunion. Davis himself seemed to acknowledge this, later saying the nomination wasn't worth purchase by anybody. Despite his posture as a compromise candidate, Davis was still a conservative. So to appeal to the progressive wing of the party, the delegates had selected Mayor Charles Bryan, the younger brother of the populist William Jennings Bryan, as Davis's running mate. Still, many progressives were less than enthused. One of them was a senator from Montana named Burton K. Wheeler. After the convention, Wheeler would say, "When the party goes to Wall Street for a candidate, I must refuse to go with it." So in August of 1924, Wheeler would abandon the Democrats and join forces with another disaffected progressive, Republican Robert Fighting Bob LaFollette. President Theodore Roosevelt had been the Republican Party's greatest progressive champion. Teddy had served in the White House from September of 1901 to March of 1909, and during his tenure, he had pushed through a number of progressive reforms, from establishing government agencies to breaking up monopolies. Teddy had chosen not to stand in the election of 1908, leaving his progressive legacy in the hands of his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. But as President Taft moved in a more conservative direction, Teddy had grown concerned, and in the 1912 election, he left the Republican Party to join the newly formed Progressive Party. Though Teddy lost the 1912 contest to progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson, he made an impressive showing. But after the 1912 election, the Progressive Party had slowly declined, until 1924, when Robert LaFollette and Burton Wheeler tried to pick up where Teddy had left off. These two senators, one Republican and one Democrat, would unite under the banner of progressivism. They would revive a forgotten political party, and in so doing, shift the balance of the 1924 contest. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wiki Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War through the war itself and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. The Progressive Party's National Convention was held in Cleveland, Ohio, less than a month after the Republican Convention. It was a small but formidable gathering of political groups devoted to the progressive cause, from laborers and farmers to women's rights advocates and socialists. In his keynote address, the party chairman laid out the progressive case. The nation has witnessed the holding of a dull and lifeless convention of political puppets in this very hall. It has also witnessed the antics of what seemed to be a disorderly mob in New York City. In Cleveland, there was the chill hand of approaching disillusion upon the party. In New York, the fever of class, religious, and sectional hatred burned in its veins. The Progressive Party had an easy decision to make. As one delegate put it, we have a leader, that lifelong, faithful servant of the people whose character, ability, and record as a constructive statesman entitle him to take his place with the greatest men this nation has produced, with Washington, with Jefferson, and with Lincoln. His name is already on your lips, his service in your hearts, his vision in your souls. Robert M. LaFollette of Wisconsin. Fighting Bob became the Progressive Party nominee with no resistance. He wrote the platform himself. It was a familiar refrain for progressives: the nationalization of railroads, regulating big business, busting up monopolies, decreasing military spending, and fighting for the American worker. The convention did not select a vice president for the ticket. That task fell to LaFollette. Fighting Bob wanted a Democrat, so he turned to Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana. In August of 1924, Wheeler agreed to be his running mate. And almost immediately, the political establishment was concerned by the resurgence of the Progressive Party. As the Washington Post put it, they call themselves progressives, but their true name is radicals. But LaFollette shunned this label. In a speech early on in the contest, LaFollette explained, "It has taken years of betrayal and a long line of shameful abuses on the part of the Democratic and Republican parties to convince the people that they must organize for political action outside both old parties in order to find relief." LaFollette and Wheeler's message of a new direction for America clearly resonated. Early polls showed LaFollette dominating in most American cities and across the American West. But as LaFollette's campaign was picking up steam, Democrat nominee John W. Davis was struggling to keep his party together. The issue that most threatened Davis's prospects for victory was perhaps the Ku Klux Klan. But all three candidates would be confronted with the issue. Though personally Senator LaFollette was opposed to the Klan, he was also aware that many of the disaffected Democrats he was trying to win over were from the South and were likely to have Klan sympathies. And though he would eventually disavow the Klan publicly, in his political platform, he had been unusually silent on the issue. Davis did not have this luxury. The issue of the Klan had been front and center at the 1924 Democratic Convention. The two factions had gone nearly to blows over the question of whether or not to condemn the Klan in the Democratic platform. The anti-Klan plank had been defeated, but a line had been drawn in the sand. Davis would have to pick a side. In August 1924, a Klan leader approached John W. Davis and handed him a letter offering him a deal. If Davis kept his mouth shut on the issue of the Klan, the Southern states would advocate for his candidacy. After reading the letter, Davis gave his answer. He tore it up. The next day, at a speech in New Jersey, Davis chose his side, saying, "If any organization, no matter what it chooses to be called, whether it be KKK or any other name, raises the standard of racial and religious prejudices, it does violence to the spirit of American institutions and must be condemned by all those who believe, as I do, in American ideals." Davis's principled stand would cost him. His condemnation of the Klan would alienate many Southern voters and push them into the arms of his opponents. In his speech in New Jersey, Davis implored President Coolidge to also condemn the Knights of the KKK. But Coolidge stuck to the Coolidge script. On the subject of the Klan, he did what he did best, said almost nothing. It's 1924, and the race for the White House is in the home stretch. The proverbial who's who of high society are gathered together for a fancy dinner. It's the type of campaign event that most presidential hopefuls relish, an opportunity to glad hand with constituents, rub elbows with the muddied interests, and say a few fanciful words in front of the press. But President Calvin Coolidge does not relish events like these. He is, at his core, a man of few words. This quality has earned him a nickname, as one guest at the party observes. Silent Cal is living up to his name tonight. He hasn't said a word. Well, I think it's refreshing. Most of these Washington politicians are full of hot air. The two dinner guests sip their pre-dinner cocktails and watch the president from afar. I don't know, look at him, he's aloof. What sort of quality is that in a leader? Just because a man doesn't say a lot doesn't mean he doesn't have a lot to say. I don't know what that means. I think it's infuriating. I think it's charming. I'm sitting next to him at dinner this evening. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Conversation? Well, I bet you can't get 3 words out of him. Oh, you're a wagering man. How much? How about $10? I'll take that bet. The two men shake on their deal. Later that night at the dinner, the man sitting next to the president does his best to make conversation. But Silent Cal doesn't engage. Not with the man or anyone else for that matter. The entire dinner, Coolidge barely says a word. Frustrated, towards the end of the night, the man with $10 to lose leans in close to the president. Mr. President, excuse me, do you see that gentleman there? The man points to his friend at the other end of the table. The man is all smiles. He's clearly winning the bet. The president politely acknowledges him with a nod. Well, Mr. President, that man bet me $10 you wouldn't say 3 words at this dinner, but I bet you would. Silent Cal considers this for a few moments. He nods his head. Then he leans in close. You lose. This story of Calvin Coolidge's witty quip at a dinner in 1924 is likely more legend than fact. Coolidge publicly denied the story's accuracy, calling it one of those rumors now current in Washington which is without any foundation. Still, conflicting versions of it appeared in various publications, from McClure's magazine to the New York Times. The details varied. Sometimes it was a young woman sitting next to the president. Other times the setup of the joke was slightly altered. But the punchline was always the same. Apocryphal or not, the tale revealed a truth about President Calvin Coolidge. He was a man of few words. He once said, "I don't recall any candidate for president that ever injured himself very much by not talking." And in the final stretch of the 1924 campaign, Silent Cal's silence would prove difficult to beat. From the very beginning, Coolidge had resolved to run a campaign in the tradition of George Washington. He had vowed not to go on the road, not to stump for his candidacy. And in the summer of 1924, his 16-year-old son Calvin Jr. had died of a blood infection. This tragic event had Coolidge further limiting his presence in the public eye. Coolidge's opponents, on the other hand, launched aggressive campaigns, making countless speeches and public appearances. In the end, though, their efforts would not be enough to overcome Coolidge's popularity or his laconic style. Coolidge won the election with 382 electoral votes to Davis's 136. LaFollette received a meager 13 electoral votes. Fighting Bob would pass away in 1925, and the Progressive Party would die with him. The Progressives had helped weaken the Democrats by fracturing the party, but even against a united Democratic Party, Coolidge still would have won. His victory margin of 25.2% is one of the largest in American history. Having won the White House on his own terms, most Americans fully expected Calvin Coolidge to run a second time. But in August of 1927, 4 years after he inherited the presidency from Warren G. Harding, Coolidge shocked the nation. At a press conference near his summer home in South Dakota, Coolidge announced he would not stand for re-election in 1928. Though another conservative Republican would rise to take Coolidge's place, the era of Coolidge prosperity, as it is sometimes called, would not last forever. After the 1928 presidential election, and after a decade of Republican dominance in politics, the Roaring Twenties would come to a screeching halt. This is episode 35 of American Elections Wiki Game, 1924, Silence is Golden. On the next episode, the election of 1928. In the wake of an unprecedented natural disaster, Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover lives up to his reputation as a master of emergencies and solidifies his status as the presumptive Republican nominee. To beat him, Democratic Governor Al Smith of New York will have to face the forces of opposition from the South. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wiki Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an airship production. Hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.